I refused to sign the fraudulent paperwork. My father shoved in my face, so he screamed that I had, until Tuesday, and after that, I would never be his daughter again. My father found me in the parking garage under my own office building. He didn't call first. He never does when he wants an advantage. He was standing by my car with a manila folder pressed flat against his chest, and when I hit the unlock button, he stepped in front of the door before I could open it. "Sign this," he said. "Now. Before you go up." He pushed the folder into my hands so hard the corner caught my knuckle. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere a car alarm chirped twice and went quiet. The garage smelled like exhaust and cold concrete. I opened the folder. 10 pages stapled twice. My company's letterhead across the top of page 3. I didn't need to read all of it. I read the sentence with my name in it, then the sentence with my brother Tanner's name in it, and I understood exactly what he was asking me to do. "No," I said. "You don't get to say no." His voice cracked down the middle, gravel underneath. "This family built you. You don't get to forget that in a parking garage. You filed paperwork for me one time 6 years ago. That's the entire extent of what this family built." His face went the color of the folder. "You have until Tuesday," he said. "Sign it, or you are not my daughter anymore." I mean that, every syllable of it. I looked at him for a long moment. 61 years old, gray at the temples, still wearing the wedding ring my mother picked out in 1988 at a jewelry counter in a mall that doesn't exist anymore. I had spent 31 years trying to earn a version of that man's approval that never once came without a price tag attached. "Okay," I said, and handed the folder back. He didn't take it. It hit the concrete between us, pages fanning out across an old oil stain. He turned and walked toward the elevator without picking a single page up. I stood by my car door for 4 minutes before my hands stopped shaking enough to drive. Then I got in, locked the doors, and sat in the dark for a while longer, because I already knew Tuesday wasn't really the deadline. Tuesday was just the day he'd chosen to say it out loud. "My name is Reese Calloway. I'm 31 years old, and this is the story of how my father tried to steal my company twice, in 2 different ways, 7 years apart, and how the second attempt was the one that finally showed me who he'd always been. To understand the parking garage, you have to understand the 26 years that came before it. I was the older child by 2 years, and from the beginning, my parents ran 2 completely different households under one roof. Mine required proof. Tanner's required nothing at all. When I was 11, I wanted a telescope. Not a toy one, a real one, with a working mirror and a tripod that didn't wobble. My father told me if I wanted it, I could earn it. So I did. I woke up at 5 in the morning for a full year and delivered newspapers on Larkspur Avenue in Denver, folding each one into a rubber band and hurling it at porches in the dark, rain or not. I saved $240. I bought a used Celestron from a man in Aurora who was getting a divorce and needed the cash faster than he needed the telescope. Tanner, who was 9, touched it once without asking, and I told him to stop. He cried. Not because he was hurt, because he'd been told his whole life that crying got him what he wanted, and it had never once failed him. 2 days later, my parents came home with a $900 telescope for Tanner, better than mine. He used it twice, then it sat in his closet until we moved. That was the blueprint for the next 20 years. I earned, Tanner received, and my parents never seemed to notice the asymmetry, or if they noticed, they never once called it by its name. There was an earlier version of the parking garage, too, one I didn't fully understand until years later. When my grandmother died the summer I turned 16, she left behind a small cabin near Estes Park that had been in the family for 3 generations, meant to pass jointly to my father and his younger sister, my Aunt Carol. My father handled the estate paperwork himself, since he was the accountant in the family, and it seemed like the practical thing to do. 6 months later, the cabin deed showed my father as sole owner, with a clause citing unpaid property tax advances he claimed to have covered on Carol's behalf over the years, structured as a lien that converted automatically into full ownership if she couldn't repay it within 90 days. Carol didn't have the money, she never got the cabin, and she stopped coming to Thanksgiving for almost a decade after that. At 16, I only understood it as a sad, distant argument between adults. I didn't understand it as a pattern until I was 31 years old, standing in a parking garage with a folder in my hands that used almost the exact same architecture. I went to Colorado State on scholarships and a part-time job at a call center, graduated with a degree in computer science and $11,000 in loans I'd taken out anyway to cover the gaps. Tanner went to a private college in Arizona that my parents paid for in full, switched majors 3 times, and graduated 4 years late with a marketing degree he's never once used professionally. At 24, I had an idea. Not a good business plan yet, just an idea, sketched on the back of a grocery receipt at a diner off Colfax. A routing algorithm that could cut fuel costs for regional logistics fleets by predicting traffic pattern shifts 6 hours out instead of reacting to them in real time. I quit my job at a mid-sized software firm, moved into a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat, and started building. I lived on rice and canned chicken for 2 years. I mean that literally. I tracked my grocery spending in a spreadsheet, and for 23 months straight, it never crossed $60 a week. I didn't go on dates. I didn't go to my college roommate's wedding in Sedona because I couldn't afford the flight and didn't want to explain why. I worked 16-hour days building what eventually became TrueLine, a piece of software that 31 logistics companies now use to move freight more efficiently across the western half of the country. My first paying client was a 9-truck freight company out of Pueblo, run by a man named Ellis Brandt, who took a chance on an unfinished beta version for $1,100 a month, back when the algorithm still crashed if you fed it more than 4 roots at once. I fixed bugs for him at midnight over the phone for a full year before Trueline was stable enough to sell to anyone else. Ellis is still a client. He came to the launch party. My parents did not. That contrast has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that period. The fact that a stranger from Pueblo believed in what I was building before my own father ever asked me a single question about how the algorithm actually worked. My father's only contribution, in the entire 7-year history of my company, was filing my LLC paperwork with the state of Colorado in March of the year I started. He was an accountant. It took him maybe 45 minutes. He brought the forms to my apartment, had me sign where he'd flagged with yellow tabs, and told me he was proud of me for taking the leap. I believed him. I wanted to believe him so badly that I didn't read past the tabs. I should have read past the tabs. I'll get to that. When Trueline finally launched publicly, 3 years later, I threw a small party at a rented event space downtown. 40 people, investors, 2 former professors, a handful of engineers I'd hired, my parents. I'd sent the invitation 6 weeks in advance. 2 days before the party, my mother texted to say they wouldn't be able to make it after all. They'd booked a trip to Cabo San Lucas with Tanner because his marketing agency, which he'd started 18 months earlier with $40,000 of my parents' money, was, in her words, going through a rough patch and needed a family morale boost. I stood in that rented event space and gave a toast to a room full of people who weren't my parents. Nobody in my family ever asked me how the launch went. I never brought it up either. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a family once everyone has agreed, without saying so, not to talk about the thing that would require an apology. There was one earlier incident, though, that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. It was the same spring my father filed the LLC paperwork. He mentioned almost offhand, over dinner at my parents' house, that he'd added what he called a standard advisory clause to protect his time, since he was doing the filing as a professional courtesy rather than charging me his normal consulting rate. I remember nodding. I remember saying thank you. I remember not asking a single follow-up question because I was 24 and exhausted and grateful that for once, my father was doing something that looked like support. I didn't think about that dinner again for 7 years. Not until the folder hit the concrete of the parking garage. 6 weeks before that, in early April, a logistics company called Apex Solutions reached out about acquiring Trueline's core routing algorithm outright. They weren't interested in the whole company, just the intellectual property and a licensing structure that would let them fold it into their existing fleet management platform. After 3 rounds of negotiation, they landed on a number, $850,000, with a portion in cash and the rest vesting over 18 months. It was, by a wide margin, the largest single event of my professional life. It also meant that for the first time, my company had a number attached to it that my family could see and want and try to touch. I told my parents about the offer at a Sunday dinner in late April, mostly because I knew Tanner would find out eventually, and I wanted it to come from me. My mother said that was wonderful, dear, in the tone she uses for things she doesn't understand and doesn't want to ask about. My father asked 3 questions, all of them about the payment structure, none of them about the algorithm itself or the 2 years of work behind it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I know better now. 2 weeks after that dinner, my father called and asked if I could come by the house on a Sunday, alone, without saying why. I should have known from the specificity of alone that something was wrong. I went anyway, because some part of me is still 11 years old, still hoping that if I show up, if I'm patient enough, he'll finally see me the way he sees Tanner without me having to earn it first. He cornered me by the grill in the backyard while my mother stayed inside setting the table, which I understood later was not a coincidence. "This isn't fair to Tanner," he said, flipping a burger he didn't need to be flipping. "His agency is failing. 2 accounts pulled out last month. He's 3 months behind on his lease. He needs that money more than you do." "I need that money," I said. "I built the thing the money is for. You'll land on your feet. You always do." He said it like a compliment. It wasn't one. It was an excuse, dressed up to sound like faith. "No," I told him. "I'm not giving Tanner any part of this deal." He smiled at the grill instead of at me, a small, tight smile that I'd learned as a child to be afraid of because it meant he already had a next move planned and my answer hadn't changed anything about it. "We'll see," he said. I left before dessert. My mother didn't ask why. 4 days later, on a Thursday morning, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Tax Compliance Update, Trueline LLC," and it came from my father's firm, Callaway and Whitfield Advisory, on official letterhead with his direct line at the bottom. I opened it standing in my kitchen, coffee still brewing. It was 11 pages, dense, formatted to look routine, the kind of document you'd normally skim and forward to a bookkeeper without a second thought. Buried on page 12 of what the footer called an attached amendment was a single clause, worded in the flattest, most bureaucratic language imaginable, transferring 85% equity interest in Trueline LLC to Tanner Michael Callaway, effective upon signature, citing a family succession restructuring that had apparently been discussed and approved by all parties. No one had discussed anything with me. I was the only party who mattered, and I'd never seen the words before that morning. I called my father immediately. He didn't pick up. 20 minutes later, a text came through instead, as though he'd wanted his words in writing this time, permanent and unarguable. "Sign the amendment by Tuesday. If you don't, you're not my daughter anymore. You're also uninvited from the anniversary gala. Your mother agrees." I read it 4 times. I called him again. This time he answered on the second second ring, and his voice was so calm it frightened me more than screaming would have. "I'm your registered agent," he said, before I could get a full sentence out. "I have the authority to file amendments on the LLC's behalf. This family takes care of its own, Reese. Tanner is drowning. You have a life raft sitting in your bank account, and you won't even throw it to your own brother. You don't have the authority to give away my company," I said. "That's not how any of this works. It's how it works when you refuse to do the right thing," he said, and hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time after that call, my back against the cabinet, my coffee going cold on the counter above me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept opening the amendment on my laptop and reading page 12 over and over, trying to find a version of the sentence that didn't mean what I knew it meant. The next morning, I drove to my office instead of staying home to spiral, because at least at the office I could do something with my hands. That was the day he was waiting for me in the parking garage with the folder against his chest, the physical printed version of the same demand, because apparently email and text weren't enough. He needed to watch my face when I said no. I said no. He gave me until Tuesday. And then for 3 days, my family went quiet in a way that felt less like a pause and more like a held breath. On Sunday, my mother called, not to talk about the amendment, to talk about the seating chart for the anniversary gala, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if I hadn't just been threatened with disownership over text message 4 days earlier. When I brought up the amendment, she sighed the specific sigh she reserves for conversations she's already decided are beneath her attention. "Your father wouldn't do anything without good reason," she said. "You know how hard Tanner is struggling? Can't you just be the bigger person?" "Being the bigger person isn't the same as giving away 85% of a company I built by myself," I said. "It's not really giving it away," she said. "It's keeping it in the family." I didn't have a response for that, because there wasn't a version of logic that made those two sentences compatible. And I understood in that moment that my mother wasn't going to be a source of reason in this. She was going to be another lever my father pulled. On Saturday, my father's oldest friend, a man named Russ Fenton, who'd known him since college and who I'd called Uncle Russ for as long as I could remember without any actual blood relation to justify it, called me out of the blue. I hadn't spoken to him directly in years, which told me immediately that my father had put him up to it. "Your dad's worried sick about this whole thing," Russ said, his voice warm in the specific, practiced way of a man used to smoothing over other people's conflicts. "I've known him 35 years, Reese. He's not a bad man. He just doesn't always know how to say what he means without it coming out wrong. Maybe you could give him a little grace here." "Did he ask you to call me?" A pause, just slightly too long. "He mentioned you two were going through something. I care about this family. I don't like seeing it fall apart over a business dispute." "It's not a business dispute," I said. "He tried to take 85% of my company and give it to my brother without my consent. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a specific thing he did on purpose." Russ didn't have much of an answer for that, and the call ended a few minutes later, polite and unresolved, one more voice recruited into a chorus meant to make my refusal feel unreasonable simply by adding volume to it. I understood, listening to him, exactly how my father operated when direct pressure didn't work fast enough on its own. He didn't escalate alone. He built a small, sincere-sounding committee around himself, people who loved him in good faith and had no idea what they were actually being asked to defend. On Monday, Tanner texted me for the first time in 3 weeks. "Hey, can we talk? I know things are weird right now." It felt, briefly, like an opening. I called him within the hour. "I didn't ask Dad to do this," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that sounded almost genuine. "You know that, right? I would never ask for something like that." "Did you know about it before I did?" A pause, half a second too long. "Not exactly. I mean, Dad mentioned he was going to help me out somehow. I didn't know the details." "Tanner, it's 85% of my company. That's not a detail. That's the entire thing. I know it looks bad," he said, "but my agency is really struggling, Reese. I've got 4 employees. If it folds, they lose their jobs too. I'm not just thinking about myself." It was, I recognized even then, a genuinely effective sentence, because it reframed my refusal as selfishness against 4 strangers I'd never met, rather than as a reasonable response to an attempted theft. I told him I was sorry his agency was struggling, and that I hoped he found a way through it that didn't involve my company, and I hung up before he could answer. Monday night, my mother called again, this time in a panic that sounded real, and I've never fully decided how much of it actually was. She said my father had been rushed to St. Joseph's with chest pains and shortness of breath, and that the doctors were running tests, and that he'd been asking for me specifically. I dropped everything. I drove to the hospital with my hands locked at 10 and 2, running 2 yellow lights I would never normally run, rehearsing an apology the entire way there, already halfway convinced I'd been too harsh, that none of this was worth losing my father over, that I should have just found a way to make everyone happy. I found him sitting up in a hospital bed, unhooked from any monitor, eating a cup of red Jell-O, looking irritated rather than frightened. The tests had come back clean. Elevated blood pressure, nothing more, and even that, the nurse told me quietly in the hallway, wasn't unusual for a man his age under ordinary stress. He'd been discharged an hour earlier. He was only still there as far as I could tell, waiting on paperwork and waiting on me. "I'm glad you're okay," I told him, meaning it, sitting down in the chair beside the bed. "You did this," he said, not looking up from the Jell-O. "The stress of this whole situation, my own daughter putting me in a hospital bed. The doctor said it's normal blood pressure for someone your age," I said. "Not a heart attack. Not stress-induced. I already talked to the nurse. While you're here, he said, setting the Jell-O aside. We might as well sort this out. I have the amendment in my bag. Sign it now, and none of this has to go any further. For my peace of mind, if nothing else. He'd brought the folder to the hospital. He'd brought it before he even knew whether the test would come back serious, which told me something about the actual order of his priorities that I didn't want to know, but couldn't unknow once I did. I left without signing anything. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes afterward, shaking, angrier at myself for running every yellow light on the way there than I was at him for staging it, because some part of me had still wanted, badly, for it to be real, for him to need me for a reason that had nothing to do with a signature. Tuesday morning, my father called at 7:15, before I'd even had coffee. Today's the day, he said. Have you thought it over? I'm not signing it, I said. It's not a legitimate transfer. You know that. You wrote it to look legitimate, but you know it isn't. You're choosing this, he said. I want you to remember that you're the one choosing this, not me. I'm choosing to keep the thing I built, I said. That's all I'm doing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that had gone strange and flat, almost like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed, he said, you have no idea what you're about to lose. I thought, at the time, that he meant the family. I thought he meant the gala, the holidays, the version of a father who occasionally called just to talk. I didn't understand, not for another 2 weeks, that he was telling me something much more specific than that and much more dangerous. He hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the clock pass 8, then 9, then noon, half expecting a follow-up call, a lawyer's letter, something. Nothing came that day. The silence was somehow worse than the threats had been. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The following morning, my phone rang with a Chicago area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Reese Calloway, this is Douglas Reyes, lead compliance officer at Apex Solutions. His voice was clipped, professional, the kind of voice that's used to delivering bad news efficiently. I'm calling because our legal team flagged something during final due diligence on the acquisition, and I need to ask you directly. Did you authorize a pending equity transfer of 85% of Trueline LLC to a Tanner Michael Calloway? My stomach dropped somewhere below the kitchen floor. No, I said. Absolutely not. Where did you see that? It came through as a filed amendment with the Secretary of State's office 2 days ago. Standard procedure on our end is to pull a full corporate history before we release funds, and this popped immediately. If it's real, it materially changes who we'd be contracting with, and we'd have to pause the deal entirely while it gets sorted out. I told him everything. The parking garage, the email on my father's letterhead, the text message threatening to disown me, the staged hospital visit 2 days earlier, folder already packed in his bag before the test results came back, the phone call where he told me I had no idea what I was about to lose. I hadn't said all of it out loud to anyone yet, and hearing it come out of my own mouth in one unbroken stretch made it sound even worse than it had felt living through it. Can you send me the amendment email directly and a copy of the withdrawal filing once it happens? Douglas asked. I want our legal team to have the full paper trail on our end too, independent of anything filed with the state. This kind of thing has a way of resurfacing months later if it isn't documented cleanly the first time. I sent him the email within the hour, along with a screenshot of the text message, time-stamped, still sitting at the top of my messages where I hadn't been able to bring myself to delete it. Douglas went quiet on the other end of the line for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When he came back, his voice had shifted, less procedural, more careful. I need to tell you something that isn't really my place to tell you, he said, but given what you just described, I think you need to hear it. Your father's firm, Calloway & Whitfield, holds the supply chain compliance audit contract for Apex Solutions, has for 6 years. He's not just some outside party filing paperwork. He's our auditor. Apex is his largest single client. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same one I'd been sitting at when he told me I had no idea what I was about to lose. If this amendment is fraudulent, Douglas continued, and it sounds like it is, your father has just used his position auditing our supply chain compliance to attempt to fraudulently seize equity in a company we're actively acquiring intellectual property from. That's not a family dispute anymore. That's a serious conflict of interest violation on his end, on top of whatever civil fraud claims you'd have personally. If he doesn't withdraw the filed amendment by 5 o'clock today, our board is going to have no choice but to terminate his firm's audit contract. He'll lose his license to practice in front of our board entirely, and he forfeits $2.5 million in vested equity tied to a long-term advisory agreement his firm signed with us 3 years ago. I didn't say anything for a long moment. $2.5 million. I had never once in 31 years heard my father mention that number, or that agreement, or the fact that his entire professional relationship with the company acquiring my algorithm was built on a foundation he'd just decided to gamble against his own daughter. I'll withdraw it, I said. I mean, I never filed it, but someone needs to tell him it's over. Legal already sent formal notice to his firm an hour ago, Douglas said. I wanted to call you myself first, though. Given everything, I thanked him, I hung up, and then I sat at my kitchen table for the rest of the afternoon, doing the only thing I could do, which was wait. At 4:30, my father called. No greeting, just venom, immediate and full-throated, the version of his voice I'd heard maybe 3 times in my entire life. You went crying to auditors? Do you understand what you've done? You've cost me my reputation. 26 years years of client relationships, and you blew it up in one phone call because you couldn't be generous for 1 week of your life. I didn't go crying anywhere, I said. Douglas called me because you filed a fraudulent transfer using a company you audit as leverage against your own daughter. That's not something I did to you. That's something you did to yourself. You'll regret this, he said. You have no idea. He hung up before I could ask him what exactly I was supposed to have no idea about. I would find out soon enough. The next morning, a cease and desist letter arrived at Callaway and Whitfield Advisory from Apex's legal department, copied to the Colorado Secretary of State's office, and to the state board that licenses accountants. By that afternoon, my father had withdrawn the amendment entirely. He didn't call to tell me. I found out because a notification from the Secretary of State's business filings portal, which I'd set up years ago and forgotten about, landed in my email with the word withdrawn stamped across the top of the filing. The buyout closed the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the deadline my father had given me in the parking garage, though by then, the deadline meant nothing at all. $850,000, the cash portion hitting my account at 2 in the afternoon. I paid off $75,000 in student loans in a single online transaction, watching the balance drop to zero with a strange, unemotional detachment, as though I were watching it happen to someone else. I signed a lease on a real office downtown, on the 14th floor of a building with a view of the mountains, the kind of office I'd pictured for 7 years while eating rice and canned chicken above a laundromat. Tanner called me that night, sobbing, calling me selfish, calling me greedy, telling me I'd ruined the family over money I didn't even need. I let him finish. Then I told him, calmly, that I hoped his agency found its footing, and that I wasn't going to be the one to fund it, and that this conversation was over. My mother emailed me 2 days later, a short clipped message informing me that under the circumstances, they felt it best if I didn't attend the anniversary gala after all. I read it standing in my new office with boxes still unpacked around me, and I deleted it without responding. Douglas called that same week and invited me to a celebration dinner with a handful of people from the Apex deal team, a gesture that struck me as oddly kind for someone I'd only spoken to over the phone twice. I said yes immediately, mostly because I didn't want to spend the night alone in an apartment above a laundromat that no longer felt like mine, replaying my mother's email in my head. The restaurant was downtown, the kind of place with low lighting and a wine list longer than the menu, smelling faintly of cedar smoke and aged scotch from somewhere near the open kitchen. I wore a new suit I'd bought that afternoon, the first item of clothing I'd purchased in 2 years that wasn't on clearance. For the first hour, it felt like exactly what it was supposed to be, a celebration. People who had never met my father asking genuine questions about the algorithm, about the 2 years I'd spent building it, about what came next. Halfway through the second course, the other executives from the deal team excused themselves one by one, murmuring something about an early flight, until it was just me and Douglas at a table built for 6. He wasn't smiling anymore. I brought you here to celebrate, he said, turning his water glass slowly by the stem. I meant that, but there's something I need to tell you, and I wanted to do it in person, off the record, before you heard it from anyone else. My stomach, which had spent the better part of 2 weeks in a near constant state of dread, dropped again, fast and total. He reached into a leather bag beside his chair and pulled out a thin folder, plain, unmarked, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward me. When our legal team pulled Trueline's full corporate history during due diligence, standard procedure, they pulled everything, 7 years back. Every filing, every amendment, every attachment ever submitted under your LLC's registration. I didn't touch the folder yet. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Your father filed something the same day he set up your company, Douglas said, buried in the original formation documents. A managerial lien clause. It grants him a retroactive 20% equity claim against the company, structured as compensation for what it calls deferred consulting fees, going back to the date of formation. I never agreed to that, I said. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. I never even saw that. I signed where the tabs were. He put yellow tabs on the pages I was supposed to sign. You were 24, Douglas said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, an acknowledgement rather than an excuse. You trusted your father to file paperwork correctly on your behalf? Most people would have. The clause sat completely dormant for 7 years. Nothing about it triggered until a specific condition was met. What condition? A change of control event, he said. Any sale, transfer, or licensing deal involving more than a certain threshold of the company's core intellectual property. Your deal with Apex triggered it automatically the moment it closed. He activated the clause 3 hours ago. I opened the folder with hands that had gone unsteady in a way I hadn't felt since the parking garage. Inside was a legal summons, formal, typed, backed by a litigator's letterhead I didn't recognize. An aggressive firm 2 floors up from my father's own office building downtown. He wasn't asking for 85% anymore. That fight was over, and he'd lost it publicly in front of his largest client. This was smaller, quieter, and in its own way far more calculated. He was demanding $210,000 in cash, due by Friday, citing 7 years of accrued deferred consulting fees under the dormant clause. If I didn't pay, the letter stated plainly, his attorney would file for an emergency asset freeze against every account associated with Trueline LLC and my personal finances, pending arbitration. I stared at my father's signature at the bottom of the summons. I'd seen that signature my entire life, on birthday cards, on report cards, on the bottom of a permission slip for a school trip to the the planetarium when I was 9. It looked exactly the same here. Sharp, slanted hard to the right, merciless in a way I'd never once associated with it before. He hadn't tried to take my company once and failed. He'd planted a second trap 7 years earlier, buried it in paperwork I trusted him enough not to read carefully, and waited patiently for the exact moment I had something worth taking. Douglas slid a business card across the table, next to the folder, without saying anything else for a moment. Her name is Vivian Cross, he finally said. She doesn't handle mergers or acquisitions work, civil defense, specifically fraud and fiduciary breach cases. She used to prosecute white-collar cases for the state before she went private. I called her an hour before you got here. She's expecting your call tomorrow at 8. I picked up the card. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear this time, but from something closer to rage, the kind that arrives late and cold once the adrenaline of the initial threat has already burned off. I had $850,000 sitting in my account. For the first time since the Tuesday deadline in the parking garage, I felt like I had nothing left at all. I called Vivian Cross at 8 the next morning, sitting in my new office with the mountains still hazy through the window in the early light. She listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes while I laid out everything: the LLC filing, the yellow tabs, the 85% transfer, the parking garage, the summons Douglas had handed me the night before. "This is one of the cleaner fraud cases I've seen in a while," she said once I'd finished. "And I mean that as a professional compliment, not a comfort. A managerial lien clause structured this way, filed by an accountant acting simultaneously as your registered agent and an undisclosed interested party, with no separate legal representation offered to you at signing and no consideration disclosed. That's not gray area. That's textbook breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on how a judge reads the timing, likely outright fraud. Can he actually freeze my accounts? He can file the motion. Filing isn't the same as winning. Given what you've described, I don't think a judge grants an emergency freeze once we get in front of one with the formation documents laid out clearly. But I want to move fast, because the threat of a freeze alone, even an unsuccessful one, can do real damage to your operating accounts and your relationship with vendors while it's pending." We met in person 2 days later, in a conference room on the 9th floor of her firm downtown. Glass-walled, quiet. The kind of room designed to make people feel like the ground under them is stable even when it isn't. She'd already pulled the original formation filing from 7 years earlier and printed it out, every page, with sticky flags marking the clause itself and the section where my father had listed himself as both registered agent and preparer, without a required disclosure of dual interest. "I want to bring this to a meeting," Vivian said. "Not a courtroom, not yet. A meeting with your father, his attorney, and us in a neutral room. I want him to see the formation documents laid out the way we've laid them out, with the disclosure violation highlighted, before he decides whether he actually wants to litigate this in open court, where his professional license is also on the line, alongside a second conflict of interest complaint that's already sitting with the state board because of the Apex situation. You think he'll back down?" "I think," she said, "that a man who buried a lien clause under yellow tabs 7 years ago, banking on his own daughter's trust, is not a man who wants a judge reading his formation paperwork out loud in a public filing. But we should be ready either way." We spent the rest of that session preparing, Vivian walking me through exactly how the meeting would likely unfold, what her opening would sound like, which documents would go on the table first, and which she'd hold back until they were needed. She asked me, at one point, whether I wanted my mother excluded from the room if she showed up uninvited, since Vivian had represented enough family disputes to know that mothers often did, whether asked or not. "Let her come," I said, after thinking about it. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering whether she'd have finally believed me if she'd been sitting in the room to hear it firsthand. Vivian nodded, made a note, and didn't argue with me, though I got the sense from the careful way she set her pen down that she'd seen that particular hope disappointed before. The meeting happened the following Thursday, in a conference room at Vivian's firm that neither side had chosen, exactly the neutral ground she'd wanted. My father arrived with an attorney I didn't recognize, a tall man in his 50s with a leather portfolio that looked more expensive than the case deserved. My mother came too, uninvited, sitting silently in the corner near the window, which told me more about how nervous my father actually was than anything he said for the first 10 minutes. Vivian opened by laying the original formation documents across the center of the table, page by page, the yellow tabbed signature pages next to the buried lien clause, the section on dual representation left conspicuously blank where a disclosure should have been. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you filed this on your daughter's behalf while simultaneously naming yourself as a 20% equity beneficiary under a dormant clause she was never separately advised about. You then activated that clause the same week your daughter refused to sign a separate and separately fraudulent transfer of 85% of the company to her brother. I'd like to hear your explanation for the record before we discuss next steps." My father's attorney started to answer for him. My father cut him off, which surprised me, because in 31 years I'd rarely seen him cede control of a room to anyone, and I'd never seen him grab it back from his own lawyer mid-sentence. "I did what any father would do," he said, looking directly at me for the first time since we'd all sat down. "I protected this family's interests. I have spent my entire career building a firm from nothing, and I have every right to be compensated for the work I did setting up that company." "You called it a favor," I said. "At the time, you told me you were doing it as a courtesy, because I couldn't afford your rate. That's what you said at your own dinner table 6 years ago. Things change, he said. Circumstances change. Tanner needed help, and you had the means to give it, and instead you humiliated this family by dragging outside lawyers and corporate compliance officers into what should have stayed private. It stopped being private the moment you used your position as Apex's auditor to threaten a company they were acquiring from, I said. It stopped being private the moment you buried a lien clause in paperwork I trusted you to file honestly. You didn't protect this family. You tried to take from the one person in it who never asked you for anything. The room went quiet. My father's attorney shifted in his seat, the particular stillness of someone recalculating how strong his client's position actually was. You staged a hospital visit, I added, because once I'd started, I found I couldn't quite stop. You brought the amendment folder to St. Joseph's before the doctors had even finished running tests, in case I felt guilty enough to sign it at your bedside. I sat with that for 2 days before I understood what I was actually looking at. That's not a father protecting his family. That's a man who saw an opening and used it. My father's attorney glanced sideways at him, a small, involuntary motion, as though this detail were new information even to the man being paid to defend it. My father didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all, which told me more than a denial would have. I want to be clear about something for everyone in this room, I continued, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I want to be clear about something for everyone in this room, I continued, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I am not signing anything. I am not paying $210,000 for consulting work that was never disclosed, never agreed to, and never performed beyond a 45-minute paperwork filing. If you pursue this, we go to court, and a judge reads every page of what's on this table, in public, alongside the complaint already sitting with the state licensing board. I don't think that's a version of this you actually want, but it's the version you'll get if you keep pushing. My mother, from the corner near the window, said my name, quiet, almost pleading, the first thing she'd said since walking in. Reese, can't we just fix this as a family? There's nothing to fix, I said, not looking away from my father. There's only something to stop, and I need him to stop. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then my father's attorney leaned toward him and murmured something too low for the rest of us to hear. My father's jaw worked once, twice, the way it used to when I was a child and he was deciding whether an argument was still worth having. Withdraw the filing, he finally said to his attorney, not to me, his eyes fixed on some point on the table between the formation documents and his own hands. We're done here. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left the conference room without another word to anyone, my mother trailing a few steps behind him, glancing back at me once with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between apology and accusation, as though I'd made her choose a side she'd never wanted to know existed. The lien filing was formally withdrawn the following Monday. Vivian filed a countermeasure anyway, a formal complaint with the state board documenting the undisclosed dual representation, both to protect me from any future attempt, and as she put it, to make sure there was a permanent record of exactly what he'd tried to do. My father made one more move after that, smaller and more desperate than any of the ones before it. 10 days after the conference room, one of Trueline's newer clients, a regional carrier out of Grand Junction, emailed my office asking to confirm that the company was, in their words, not currently under any ownership dispute, because they'd received an anonymous letter suggesting otherwise. The letter, unsigned, used language specific enough that Vivian recognized the phrasing from the withdrawn amendment almost immediately. We couldn't prove who sent it, not definitively, not in a way that would hold up anywhere formal, but the postmark was from a zip code 2 blocks from my father's office, and I've never needed a lab report to know what I already knew. I called the client myself, walked them through the entire situation, sole ownership, formation documents, the withdrawn filings, and they stayed. Not every client would have. I lost one smaller contract that same month to a competitor who I suspect got wind of the same rumor secondhand, though I was never able to trace that one back to anything specific enough to act on. My bank froze one outgoing vendor payment for 11 days in late July, a routine compliance hold triggered, according to the branch manager, by an external inquiry regarding account ownership status. Nobody would tell me who had made the inquiry. Priya spent most of a week on the phone untangling it, faxing notarized formation documents to a compliance department that seemed to lose them twice before finally releasing the hold. It cost me a mildly furious phone call with a vendor who'd gone unpaid for almost 2 weeks through no fault of his own, and it cost me a specific low-grade fury that took a long time to fully drain out of my system, the particular anger of being forced to prove, over and over, that something you already legally owned was actually yours. The fallout, once it started, didn't move in a straight line. It moved outward in every direction at once, the way a dropped glass sends fragments further than you'd think possible. My father's license went under formal review within 3 weeks. The Apex conflict of interest complaint and the state board complaint from Vivian's firm arrived almost simultaneously, and the board doesn't love coincidences like that. He kept his license in the end, but with restrictions and a public reprimand that any client could find with a basic search, and Apex never renewed his firm's audit contract. The $2.5 million invested equity Douglas had mentioned was gone, forfeited under the terms of an agreement my father had apparently never once imagined he'd violate. Callaway and Whitfield Advisory lost 4 other clients within 2 months, smaller firms that had done business with my father for years, and quietly decided, once the reprimand became public record, that they'd rather not. Tanner's agents agency folded entirely in August. I heard about it from a cousin, not from him directly, since he hadn't spoken to me since the sobbing phone call the night the buyout closed. He took a job managing social media accounts for a car dealership in Aurora, which he apparently mentions to no one if he can help it. Part of me, the part still 11 years old with a telescope I'd earned and a brother who'd been handed a better one, felt something ugly and satisfied about that. Most of me just felt tired. In October, Tanner sent me a single text message, out of nowhere, no lead-in. I'm sorry I let him use me as an excuse. I didn't know about the lien thing until it was already blowing up. I still think you could have helped me, though. I read it a dozen times, trying to decide whether it was an apology or just another version of the same request dressed up as one. I never figured out a clean answer. I wrote back that I appreciated him saying the first part, and that I hoped the dealership job worked out for him, and I left the second half of his message alone entirely, because some sentences aren't worth answering, only acknowledging. My mother called twice in the weeks after the conference room meeting. The first time, she wanted to talk about anything except what had happened: the weather, a neighbor's renovation, a recipe she'd seen online, and I let her, mostly because I didn't have the energy to redirect her. The second time, she asked carefully whether I thought there was any way to move past this as a family, and I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know, and that I wasn't ready to pretend I did just to make the conversation easier for her. There was one unexpected ally in all of it. My Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, called me out of nowhere in early September. I hadn't spoken to her in years beyond holiday small talk, not since the cabin. Not really, though neither of us had ever said that out loud before that call. I saw the board complaint, she said. It's public record. I check sometimes, I'll admit, more out of habit than anything healthy. She laughed, short and without much humor in it. I know exactly what that clause looked like before I even read the details. He did something almost identical to me with our mother's cabin, back when you were still in high school. I imagine you don't remember much of it. I remember more than you'd think, I told her. I just didn't understand it yet. She told me the rest of it that afternoon, details I'd never had, how she'd hired her own lawyer at the time, briefly, before deciding the legal fees alone would cost more than the cabin was worth, and how she'd let it go instead, the way people do when a fight feels unwinnable and exhausting in equal measure. How my father had shown up to her house once, months later, insisting the 90-day repayment clause had been standard practice, nothing personal, purely financial, the exact same phrase, standard practice, that had shown up in the email he'd sent me 31 years later. He believes his own paperwork, Carol said. That's the part that used to frighten me most. He's not lying exactly, not the way most people lie. He's found a way to make the taking sound procedural, so he never has to feel like he's actually done it. She told me she was proud of me for being the first person who'd ever made him actually lose something because of it: license restrictions, forfeited equity, 4 departed clients, a public reprimand with his own name attached to it in searchable text. I never had the resources to make him face a single consequence, she said. You did. I hope that means something to you, even on the days it doesn't feel like enough. It did mean something. I cried after that call, quietly, in my new office, for reasons I couldn't fully untangle. Relief, mostly. Some grief mixed in underneath it, the kind that shows up uninvited even when you know you're not wrong to feel what you feel. There were logistical complications that dragged on longer than I expected. Truline's business insurance carrier required a full incident report once the lien filing became a matter of public record, which meant reliving the entire timeline in writing for an adjuster who kept asking clarifying questions in a tone that made it clear he found the whole situation almost unbelievable. My accountant, a woman named Priya, who I hired the week after the conference room meeting specifically because she had absolutely no connection to my family, spent an entire afternoon walking me through every filing my father had ever touched on Truline's behalf, checking for anything else buried in the paperwork. There was nothing else, just the one clause, patient and dormant for 7 years, waiting. The anniversary gala happened without me in late September. I found photos of it later, not because I went looking, but because a family friend posted one online and it surfaced in a search I didn't mean to run. My parents smiling in matching dark blue, Tanner beside them in a suit that looked slightly too big, the way things do when you buy them during a rough patch and can't quite afford to have them tailored. I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and went for a walk, because there wasn't anything useful to do with the particular kind of grief that photo produced, except let it move through me and out the other side. I mourned that fall, in a way I hadn't expected to. Not the father I'd had, the father I hadn't. There's a version of this story where my dad calls me the day the buyout closes, genuinely proud, no strings attached, and I let myself imagine that version more than once, sitting alone in my new apartment with the boxes finally unpacked. It never existed. It was never going to exist, but grieving something that was never real turned out to be its own particular kind of work, slower than I expected, and not something a legal victory could touch. By November, Truline had grown to 9 employees. I hired 2 engineers I'd worked with years earlier at the mid-sized software firm, back before any of this started, people who'd believed in the algorithm before it was worth anything to anyone. Douglas and I stayed in touch, mostly professional, occasionally something closer to friendship, the kind that starts oddly in a legal crisis, and holds anyway because the 2 people involved turned out to actually like each other once the crisis passed. I still live in Denver, in an apartment 2 miles from the laundromat I used to live above, close enough that I drive past it sometimes without meaning to. My office on the 14th floor still has the same view of the mountains I pictured fired for 2 years while eating rice and canned chicken. Trueline crossed 40 client contracts this spring. I pay myself a modest salary and reinvest almost everything else. Not because I have to anymore, but because building something slowly, on my own terms, is still the only kind of security I actually trust. Last winter, almost a year to the week after the parking garage, I bought myself a telescope. Not the Celestron kind I saved newspaper money for at 11. A real one this time. A proper reflector with a motorized mount. The kind of thing I could never have justified as a want, rather than a need for most of my adult life. I set it up on the balcony of my apartment on a clear night in January, and looked at Jupiter for almost an hour. 4 small moons lined up like a row of stitches, and I thought about the $900 telescope that sat in Tanner's closet, barely touched, and about how differently the same object can sit in 2 different hands. Mine still gets used. That felt, in a way I hadn't fully expected, like the actual ending of the story, more than any courtroom filing or withdrawn amendment ever did. I don't talk to my father. I've spoken to my mother a handful of times since the conference room. Careful, distant conversations that never quite become anything more than logistics. Birthdays acknowledged with a card and nothing more. A brief exchange at a cousin's baby shower in the spring where we both worked hard to talk about anything except the 2 people not in the room. Tanner and I haven't spoken beyond that one October text since the sobbing phone call the night the buyout closed. Aunt Carol comes to Denver twice a year now, and we get dinner at a small Italian place near my office, and she tells me stories about my father I never knew. Stories about who he was before he became who he became, and I've mostly stopped needing to hear all of them, though I let her tell them anyway, because I think she needs to say them almost as much as I once needed to know them. I started seeing a therapist in November, a woman named Dr. Okafor who specializes in what she calls high-control family systems, a phrase I didn't have language for until she offered it to me. Most of our sessions aren't about my father directly anymore. They're about the smaller residue he left behind, the reflex I still catch myself in sometimes, the instinct to over-explain a decision to someone who was never actually going to ask me to justify it, the way I still, occasionally, brace for a folder to appear out of nowhere in an ordinary parking lot. My father told me in that parking garage that if I didn't sign, I would never be his daughter again. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else from that entire year, because here's the strange truth I've landed on, the one I didn't expect and don't fully love, but that I've made a kind of peace with anyway. He was right, in a way he never intended to be. I'm not his daughter, not in the way he meant it, not in the way that requires me to hand over what I built the moment he decides he's owed it. I stopped being that particular daughter the day I refused to sign, and I don't think I'm going to go back to being her. What I am instead is someone who built a company from a grocery receipt and 2 years of rice and canned chicken, who trusted the wrong person with the wrong paperwork once, and who learned, slowly and expensively, exactly what that trust is worth and exactly what it costs to take it back. I earned every version of the life I have now. Nobody handed me a better telescope. I bought my own twice, and the second time, I made sure to read every single page before I signed anything at all. Something real was lost that year. I don't pretend otherwise, even now. There's no version of this story where I get to keep both the company and the father I wanted him to be, and some nights, that particular math still finds me, quiet and uninvited, long after the legal filings and the withdrawn liens stopped mattering to anyone but me. I think about the version of him at my launch party that never happened, the one who flies home early instead of going to Cabo, the one who reads all 11 pages of a document instead of writing them. I let myself grieve that version for exactly as long as I need to, and then I close the laptop, or turn off the balcony light, or just breathe, and I let it pass through instead of setting up camp inside it. But I've learned there's a difference between a family and a transaction dressed up to look like one, and I'm no longer willing to confuse the two, not even for him, not even on the days I still, against my better judgment, miss the man I thought he was. Alice Brandt still calls every couple of months just to check in. No agenda, nothing to sign. Douglas and I get dinner when he's in Denver. Aunt Carol texts me photos of her garden. Priya caught a filing error last month that would have cost me $4,000, and she caught it because she was paying close attention, not because a contract obligated her to. None of them share my blood. All of them, in the ways that turned out to matter most, have shown up for me more consistently than the people who did. I built a company on the belief that the shortest route isn't always the one that looks fastest at the start. It turns out the same is true of family. The long way, the honest way, the way that costs you something real before it gives you anything back, is still the only route I trust anymore. My father wanted a version of me that would sign whatever was placed in front of her, quickly, quietly, out of love or guilt or exhaustion. I'm not her. I don't think I ever fully was, even before the parking garage. I just needed one folder, hitting the concrete, to finally prove it to myself.